And I'm probably gonna have to mute YouTube so we don't get the feedback.
Yeah, I'm waiting for it to pop up. Oh, there we go. All right, mine's muted. So since we're here, we don't really know what to go over unless you guys ask specific questions. So we'll have the chat open. So Cecilia, if you have any questions, just let us know. Jeff, it looks like you have a webcam and you can talk to us. So if you have any questions, just feel free to let us know. We'll try to go over it.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. It's an older web. It's the laptop webcam. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Hi, Steven. Welcome. We're just getting started, so you haven't missed anything.
Hey.
So I did have a question on 4C from the review. Essentially just trying to understand why the approach was a little bit different than 4B. Like 4C was recognizing the time shift and applying the properties, whereas 4B was more of a straightforward identity. Could you not use that same technique on 4C?
Let me see. I think I did that on the midterm review.
Yeah, I have it here too. I'm gonna go ahead and screen share real quick.
Sure.
I'll present it.
Do you want to take this, James, or do you want me to?
You got it up. You go for it.
Okay, I gotta look at it for a second to see what I actually did. But so here we're looking at 4, B, and C. So you're asking why 4C is different than 4B. My notes here say that 4B we can use just a straight up transform pair, and we get a simple answer. 4C is the same thing as 4B, the same expression except that it's shifted over by 1. If we plotted it, 4B looks like that. 4C looks exactly the same except for it's shifted. Ignore that little smudge there. That's just a smudge. So I wrote here, same signal as in part B, but it's time shifted. So what this allows us to do is to use the time shift property directly instead of having to resolve this problem finding a transform pair. So by doing that, basically you just get this out front. But let me pop over to our key concepts. So this problem is discrete time transform, so that's chapter 9. No, that's chapter 5. Discrete time transform pair. So we're going to scroll down to table 5.1 and look at this time shift property. Where is it? Time shifting. 5.3.3 time shifting. So anytime you have an answer for a problem, and then you get another problem that's the exact same, but it's time shifted, you're going to use this property, and all that changes, you get the exact same answer, except that you can put this in front, this e to the negative j omega pi naught. Let me zoom in so I can see it better. But so that's all you have to do. Does that answer your question, or is there more to it?
I guess maybe what I'm asking is if we had followed the same method, assuming that 4B did not exist,
okay,
we'd follow the same method as 4B. Would the answer have been the same? I'm assuming
it should be, you know, in theory. So 4B was also the same as 4A, if I remember correctly. Although it's been a long time since I've looked at this. So what's the difference?
4A was slightly different.
Oh yeah, 4A is way different. So how did I solve B then? Well, it's just a direct transform pair.
Right.
So okay, then if we're looking at 4C for the first time and we never got to see 4B, we never got to solve it directly, we would use the transform pair. Let me pop over to the key concept thing and see this real quick. This is back in chapter 5. So we're going to scroll down. We know we have a signal that is just a sum of unit steps. which is also the same thing as a periodic square wave, but except for it's not periodic, so that's not right. So this is probably closest. So this says that we basically have a pulse, just a single pulse. Right? Am I reading that right? So it's a 1 when we're below a certain value and it's a 0 everywhere else. Yeah, so this is just a pulse, but it's been shifted.
That would be a step function.
Yeah. So we have this transform pair. Here, pop back over to my notes. Use the right one, yeah. Sine omega 2 plus half over sine omega 2. So, okay, I see what I did, I think. So I used this guy here, it looks like, and we applied a time shift to this thing. Because our version of this problem is this thing, but it's shifted over.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have to use this in addition to a time shift, and you would get the same problem, the same answer, I mean. Except that we don't have an EJ omega in front here. So why not?
Yeah, that's what was a little confusing to me.
So this is u to the n plus 2 minus u to n minus 3. So this is basically two-step functions next to each other. You could think of it that way. Otherwise, it's just a pulse. There's this one. And this transform pair is... Oh, yeah, this transform pair is the same thing. Because this is the absolute value of n. So it reflects across the y-axis. So what problem B is this expression, except that n1 is a particular value in this case. And n1 in this case was 3 or 2 actually.
I think 2.
Yeah, 2. Yep. So why is C different? Well, if you solve this one by hand without looking at B, you're going to have to recognize that this is just a pulse. You would then use this property and then do the time shift. So you're going to have to do this extra step anyways. You're basically going to have to solve this problem here, recognizing this is a default unshifted pulse, and then apply the time shift to it. So it was convenient that the homework problem or this review had both back-to-back like this. But yeah, if you saw this one by itself, you would be doing this first and then apply the time shift. Does that make sense? Now the reason why you would do that, so let's say we drew this out. This is our expression.
Oh, I see. So it's not symmetrically reflected across the y-axis. Looks like.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So first you need to shift it to make it reflect across the y-axis.
Got it.
And then recognize that you did apply a time shift to it to then finally get this e to the minus j omega.
Got it. Okay, that's the key piece I was missing.
Yep.
Thanks.
No problem. You know, there is another way, too, a lot longer. Well, let me take a look before I finish speaking or saying what I'm going to say. So since we're in discrete time, and these are all just pulses, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pulses. I could write an expression that's not 2 terms, but it's 5 terms. I could just say I have a direct delta n minus 1 plus direct delta n minus, or plus, I'm sorry, minus 1. This was plus 1 over here. But you get what I'm trying to say. You could write it out as 5 discrete, 5 individual spikes, and then apply your Fourier transform to 5 individual problems, I guess you could say. And the Fourier transform you would use to do that takes a little bit longer, but I guess it would be this one. That's not right. It would be this one. So you'd have a direct delta at some point, and your Fourier transform is always going to be this. Whatever this value is, you would just stick this in there. And then you would add these all up. You would add 5 of these up together and then combine terms to get basically a single term.
Yeah, that's actually what I started doing, but I realized that was going to take a really long time.
Yeah, it's not very efficient. This method was probably used to initially find this this solution back when Fourier transforms were first being invented. But since it takes so long, we don't do it anymore.
Yeah.
because you got to keep in mind this thing here, this solution, and you can use Euler's identity and turn this into a series of complex exponentials.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, get the same thing,
Right.
but just a series of them.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We have any other questions?
Steven, do you have any questions, or Cecilia? That's all right. Say that right. Then.
Yeah, I think portion C of problem 3.
Portion C of problem 3.
Yeah, let me look at my notes here. It was yeah, why is the range within the domain from negative pi to pi when the pulse function was pi over 2 or negative pi over 2 to pi over 2? And why did the magnitude change to 1/2? I guess I'm not completely following that.
So 3C.
Yeah, so if you look in B, the P function is pi over 2. And then when we do the multiplication property within part C, why did we adopt the magnitude of 1/2? I guess I'm just not completely following that.
So the 1/2 comes from your transform property. Let me pop over to that real quick.
Okay.
Convolution, right?
Yeah. So this right here, 5.5. I assume you can see my screen right now. Again, but
yeah.
Whenever we have something in the time domain that's multiplication, when you convert it to the Fourier domain, it becomes convolution, and that's what this expression says: is this minus that coefficient in the front, the 1 over 2 pi. This whole thing is literally the definition of convolution. So if I had written this table, I would have wrote this as just x of, j omega, or x of e to the j omega, or whatever, to with the asterisk y e to the j omega, so that people knew that this was convolution if they forgot the definition itself. But anyways, knowing that multiplication in the time domain is convolution in the frequency domain, we also have this scalar that goes out in front of it, since we're talking about a Fourier transform rather than a Fourier series or any of the other things that we've seen this property before. So this 1 over 2 pi will then cancel with the, go back to the problem.
Yeah, no, I see where the pi cancels now.
Okay.
Sorry. But going back to the same problem in C, why is it now negative pi to pi? I guess that's where my notes are at. Sorry.
Okay, so we have this, and you're asking why this is different than this?
Yeah. Yeah.
I got it here actually, because when you do the Fourier transform of the x, you're 0 outside of the absolute value of pi half. So,
oh, yep. Well, hold on.
So when you go from negative pi to pi, let me see the key.
Yeah, I was looking. That's where I got it from. Was the key? I almost looked at it and said, "Why is it?"
Where is the key? Final. Practice problems. Homework quiz. Oh, there it is. Practice exam. Practice final key. Open. There we go.
So the reason why is because whenever, so this this P of T we know from part B to be this this representation here. Now, whatever x of t is, let's pretend like we didn't know what x of t was. X of t happens to be this right here. But let's pretend like we don't know. whenever you do the convolution, this convolution right here, well, in the frequency domain, so this basically this convolution right here, we know that we're going to be flipping one of these signals and then moving it across this. So when the signal first touches this portion here, it'll start creating our shared area. Then as you move it along, the leading edge will then hit the lagging edge of this expression here, and then continue until the lagging edge slides past this edge here. Does that make sense? So you're doubling this as it moves across here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Do you remember earlier in the first half of the semester when we had those I think it was that lab or those practice problems that had you mess around with, I think, what's it called, JDSP or JDRS or something? And you had to physically slide one signal over the other?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so when you're physically sliding one object over another, they start to share area when the leading edge of this signal moves up to this edge here, and then it continues through it. So we have a shared area of this one plus the length of the other one. So you're doubling it. If they both have the same length, you're doubling it. I hope that makes sense. I can see it in my head. Maybe I should pull up those.
Well, no, that's okay. I just based on what you were saying with the leading edge crossing the threshold of, let's say, negative pi over 2. So it's now starting to adopt the area of what the convolution is, correct?
So it's just like this animation here.
Yeah.
I'll wait for Wikipedia to reset. So we have the leading edge touching the lagging edge of this one. They start sharing area. You can see that both signals have the same length, but our output has double the length. So that's kind of the analog to what's happening in this problem, where we have some signal that has this length, and our output appears to be double the length.
Okay.
So just to reiterate, our x of j omega we found in part A to be some to have the same length as what this expression has. So this has a length pi over 2, and this has a length pi over 2. So just based on that information alone, we would expect our convolution output to have double that length.
Okay. I'll work with that. Just I'll pull it apart a little bit more.
Here, I actually worked out the integration on this. I used the x of j omega to set the limits, and just if you integrate the delta function, you get a step function. So when you plug in, those limits, it just confirms the doubling of the period there. So,
okay.
Can you see his screen when he talks?
No, but I'm visualizing what he's talking about with the integration and
I switched to mine.
Yeah, click on his name so you can see his screen. He's got his notes pulled up.
Oh, I see how you guys do. Sorry.
Right, so essentially those would come from the limits of integration in the convolution if you actually did the integral.
Right. Well, I mean, if you do it graphically or if you do it through the math, you should get the same. Everything should confirm itself.
Okay.
And I'll upload this. I guess I haven't put this on the Aussie yet, so I'll put this up there so you guys can take a look at it.
Yeah, I should have uploaded mine too. I did last semester for sure because it was the first time I had created the document, but I think I forgot to this semester.
Yeah, and again, I think that's one of those tricky things with convolution is trying to figure out where the leading edge of the function it's sliding is.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's what kind of sets up everything else.
Yeah. Luckily, in industry, once you guys graduate, you probably won't ever have to do this stuff by hand. You'll just use MATLAB and then just, write a line of code and the computer will do it for you.
That's reassuring.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Or, things?
So I've only gotten to 7 in the review. And I'm pretty much okay up until that point. So I think I'm, at least for now, I'm okay.
So 7, which one's a sampling? 8, 7 sampling. Yep. Basically, I mean, if the finals are anything like before, this is a very good prep for the finals. Basically, like, gotta have one. I said, if your finals like the previous finals or I've seen, it's gonna look like basically this is a good prep for it. Anything on here is a fair game for the final, and I don't think anything on the final is not on here.
Got it.
In general. But.
Have you had a chance to watch our video that we did last semester? It goes over every problem that's on the practice exam.
Oh yeah, I started watching it, and like I was saying, got up to number 7. So.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Do we do a good job in what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I think so.
Never really got feedback on it.
Yeah, I think so. It was I had to pause it a couple times and rewind just to kind of focus on what you guys are saying, but it does a really good job of breaking down and explaining things.
Sweet. Have you guys seen anything like this before? So here, I wrote this last semester, and it kind of breaks down each of the types of transforms and whatever else that we do throughout this course, and basically what each one's meant for. And like, so like when I first took this class, I wondered why would I use a Fourier transform when I have a Fourier series, or like why do I need a Laplace transform if we already learned the Fourier transform, things like that. So I have this document here, if you guys can see my screen, that explains the purpose of each type of transform and why we have multiple different versions. So like for the Fourier series, the first thing we learned in this course, well, the first thing we learned was how to write notation for signals and systems, and then we learned convolution. But then after that, the real course started, and we learned Fourier series. Fourier series was for steady state frequency analysis of specifically periodic signals, both in CT and DT, continuous and discrete time. Then we moved on to the Fourier transform, which was literally the same thing as the Fourier series, except for now we can do it for any and all signals, for non-periodic signals included, whereas the Fourier series was only for periodic. But we have signals all the time that are non-periodic, like temperature or, I don't know, how hot something is, whatever. But then we get into the Laplace transform after the midterm. And the Laplace transform is literally the exact same thing as a Fourier transform, except that a Laplace transform includes more information than the Fourier transform is capable of. And the thing that it does different, or that it includes, is your transients. So whenever we do the Fourier transform in the Fourier series, that is for a signal in steady state. After, I can't remember if differentials is a prereq for this course, but if it's not, and there's students in here that have not taken differentials before, differentials tells us that we might have a system when it first starts off might look different than what it looks like after it's been on for a while. After, at some point the system will settle into a steady state. But if we want to do an analysis on a system, and we need to know what the transients are, how that system behaves when we first turn it on, that's what the Laplace transform is for. That's what it does in addition to what the Fourier transform can provide. Now, the Laplace transform itself is for continuous time. So we need the same thing, but for discrete time, and that's what the Z transform is for. So the Z transform is the Laplace transform just for discrete time. A little conceptual stuff for GWiz, but not really directly applicable to anything on the exam. It's just, I think it helps people visualize it in their head, I guess.
Yeah, that does help to understand it conceptually.
And the transients for us as EEs is heavily applicable to RC circuits, right?
When you first turn on a circuit, yes. A transient, so like
Yeah,
an
that's
RC
what I mean.
circuit, when it first turns on, it will,
Build a
your
charge.
capacitor's not charged yet, and there's a little period of time where it has to charge up, and then it can start discharging power into the circuit and stuff. So
It's really applicable to AC circuits too.
yeah, it's applicable to a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have seen it again and again.
Looks like Cecilia
That's
has
a good
question.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for the summary, though. I mean, it's obvious now that we get to Z transforms when we look back and we see how it kind of breaks up, but the steady state and the transient verbiage within your summary here is helpful for further applications.
So Cecilia also had a question. She said, if the Laplace Z transform is a more general version of the Fourier transform, are there situations where you would need to use the Fourier and could not use the Laplace? And that's no. If you can do a Fourier transform on it, you can do a Laplace transform on it. But if you can't necessarily say the same thing if you can do a Laplace versus Fourier. If there isn't a completely imaginary solution for the Laplace, then the Fourier won't work. Will fail. Does that answer the question?
So just to have more words on that subject, let me pop over to, I think it's chapter 9. When we first introduced the Laplace transform, we define it with this expression that looks very similar to the Fourier transform. Wrong one. So the Fourier transform is the integral of some signal times a complex exponential. Well, the Laplace transform is the exact same thing. It's the integral of some signal times a complex exponential, except that we use s instead of omega. Now, s is a much larger quantity than what omega is, j omega, I guess. So s is complex by itself, and the full expression for s is sigma plus j omega. So right there is where we add information to the Laplace transform that the Fourier transform can't accommodate. The Fourier transform is a special case of the Laplace transform when sigma is 0. So we're just left with the j omega for the Fourier transform. But in cases where sigma is not 0, that's when we use the Laplace transform. So if you have a signal or a system or whatever, and you're trying to write it as math or whatever, and you've analyzed it and written it out, if your sigma is 0, you could just go ahead and use the Fourier transform. If your sigma is non-zero, then you're forced to use the full Laplace transform. Now, as engineers, this also it matters what you care about when you're analyzing a system too. You're not going to waste time on doing a more lengthy Laplace transform when a Fourier transform will give you the information you need. Let's say, for example, that sigma is non-zero, but you only care about when sigma is 0. And you're not even going to be building anything that it matters when sigma is non-zero. Then you can go ahead and use the Laplace the Laplace transform in that case. That's just a design decision that you would make based on economics, or if you know that the user is never going to use the system during the transient phase, when you have those transients when you first turn the system on, and you can guarantee the user will only use your circuit when it's in steady state, then you can use the Fourier transform, even though a transient does exist.
Sorry, Stephen, if I cut you off there. Any other questions, or did I miss one? Well, I posted this last semester some extra work we could do. I don't know if you want to take a look at these. These are a lot harder than you'd ever see on your exam. Like this one you can't really see that well, but if you want to see an example of a system with multiple transfers and how to calculate the H function for this whole total system, I can post all this stuff up if you want. It's really, really involved and confusing. It took me like 4 times to try and figure out. But I think this is a fun one we could go over. The discrete time, whose y input and yn input and xn are related by this is your transfer function. So part A is to find h of z, which is something you'll have to do for sure. So you've got the function here. Your h of z is just the coefficients of your y's and your z's. And then to find the h, I think the next part was to find h of, sorry, this is not loading fast. Yeah, to find h of n. It's the same usual procedure. You find h of jw, or h of z in this case, and then do your partial fractions and then your inverse Fourier transforms, and to get that. So like I said, this is a harder problem than you'd probably see on an exam because it's pretty involved. But that's that. Well, I mean, if there's no questions, we call it good. I'll upload this stuff to Piazza as well.
I have a quick question. What comes after this in signal analysis? Is it random analysis 350?
Yeah, the general is 350, and then there's also signals 2, which I think is 304.
That's correct.
As an area pathway. I'm a power guy, so I haven't taken 304 and don't plan on taking 304.
I'm taking 304 next semester.
Yeah.
If one is interested in heading down the route of power systems, but also controls as well, would you consider just continue pursuing signals and systems through, obviously random's required, but
we must get into the lines. I have an idea. Oh, it's a good one. It's not going so well here.
I'm going to mute Jacqueline.
No, it's okay. But when do we pick up the more complicated systems that you threw out there? Is that in signals and systems too? Or is it in random?
I haven't taken either of those. I'm taking random this summer, and I'm not planning on taking 304. As for controls, what are you talking about? So power system controls, are you talking like a building monitoring system, or are you like controls for like if you were to make an inverter to control the inverter and control the rectifier, that kind of thing?
Yeah, both.
That would be in 472. I took that class last. We used Fourier transforms quite a bit in that class.
Okay, thanks.
It was 472. As in like building monitoring controls and that kind of stuff, I'm not real sure on that. I work with that in my job, but I don't.
By the way, the signals and systems course that we just completed or about to complete, and signals and systems 2, these are very abstract, high-level interpretations of signals and systems, I guess. But in a whole bunch of classes, there's dozens of classes that could use this information, but they go about it in a more direct way. So like, for example, when you take your Circuits 1 and Circuits 2 class, those are ripe for using a lot of this information that we learned in this course. But we don't use it very often because we're more focused, in those courses, you're more focused on calculating the actual specifics of a circuit, you know, like what the voltage level here is or the current at this point. But if you want to design a circuit, or let's say you're working in integration where you're putting a bunch of different circuits that have already been built and designed together, you want to know how these circuits behave with each other before you've even looked at, you know, the values of the resistors you're going to put in the circuit or the values of the capacitors. You just want to see in a very general sense that the system will work. That's what the knowledge in this course is used for. I would say Signals and Systems 1 and Signals and Systems 2 course knowledge is more for when you write algorithms to analyze systems for you, rather than building a specific circuit like on a breadboard or, you know,
Sure.
in a box or something.
Yeah, anytime you calculate the impedance of a capacitor or impedance of an inductor, you're using Fourier transforms. You're just plugging it into a pre-solved equation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Fourier transforms are used all over physics and other disciplines too, not just in engineering when we want to build stuff, but like to actually understand how some systems work. So if you ever get a chance to read the history of Fourier transforms and Laplace transforms, I think it was Isaac Newton first came up with a Fourier transform, and his purpose in developing the mathematical tools of the Fourier transform was to figure out how heat transfers in an object that's placed next to a hot source. So completely unrelated to the stuff that we've seen in the stuff we're going to apply to circuits and engineering type stuff, or electrical engineering type stuff. Fourier transforms have wide-reaching capabilities. It's just a very abstract tool, and so you could use it in any course.
Okay. If so, you know, in the midterm review, you touched on aliasing, you know, real quick. Obviously, it's more applicable now to the second half. I know there's not really anything in the alias category that I saw on the final review, but the videos weren't incredibly detailed in that subject. Is it something we should worry about, or do you guys just want to do a quick summary of it real quick?
I can do a quick summary of it, conceptually speaking.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so aliasing, let me pull up the little, I like this cool little graphic that's on Wikipedia. I'm going to pull it up real quick.
Yeah, it's related to the Nyquist, so it is in there. It's just not explicitly stated as aliasing. But if you see Nyquist, you can think to prevent aliasing is why you set the Nyquist or you set the Nyquist.
So when you see anti-aliasing, is it essentially the Nyquist? Or is it more involved in that?
All anti-aliasing does, like if you're talking about like your graphics card for a computer game or something,
right,
all it's doing is changing your sample rate to a much higher value. So it doesn't really do anything else.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's some advanced concepts that I don't know about that maybe anti-aliasing does, but I just pulled up the Wikipedia page on aliasing, and it gives some examples here, where like here's a photo that's properly aliased, or in other words, the camera itself that took this picture was taking images and putting it into memory at a rate that matches what the ambient frequency would be. In real life, there is no ambient frequency. It's just, you know, you're getting light at all points in time. But let's say you take a camera and you're trying to take a picture of a monitor. Well, a monitor refreshes its display. You know, if we're talking about a 60 hertz monitor or a 120 hertz monitor, it's refreshing the screen every 100. It's doing it 120 times a second, right? So if your camera takes samples, let's say, I don't know, 80 times a second, and your monitor's outputting a new image 120 times a second, they're not synced up, and so there's going to be points in time where your camera captures an image that the monitor is blank because it hasn't rewritten the display yet. Does that make sense? So in that case, you would get aliasing. That's what this picture down here is showing. Is this picture looks like somebody took a picture of this brick building, but on a monitor. Here's another version of aliasing. Back in the early days of Microsoft or Windows, what were the old versions of Windows back in the 90s? Where you had crappy displays and
95, 90.
Yeah, yep.
31, yeah.
Yeah, as computer monitor resolutions increased, but OS, the operating system hadn't updated its display of a character like in the as an alphabet. You would start seeing these choppy letters like this, and users were complaining. So Microsoft, instead of updating all of the alphabet character like maps, I guess you could say, or the images for them, they just applied an anti-aliasing thing to it to smooth the edges, and that's what this is. So that one's a little harder to describe, but it's kind of the same thing. Now, conceptually, what aliasing is I really like this picture and this picture here. Which one's better for what I want to talk about now? They're both the same. So let's look at this one. I assume you guys can see it, right? All right, so on aliasing, if I, let's say I undersample and I haven't met the Nyquist rate, and I have some signal that, I'm gonna figure out which one's which. So let's say this blue line is my signal, whatever it is. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's temperature, maybe it's some voltage at some point in a circuit. I don't know, who cares? But whatever it is, the blue line is my signal of interest. Now, since I'm talking about, let's say we're talking about a digital system that's discrete time by nature, and I start taking samples. That's what these little black dots are. These little black dots are, I'm taking samples at an equal interval. So let's say every second I'm taking a sample. All I have is just this dot, this amplitude. I don't have anything in between. So if I wanted to reconstruct this blue line with the black dots that I'm given, well, if I haven't met the Nyquist rate, there's multiple signals that can meet that same pattern. And that's what this brown line is. This brown line is an alternative. This brown line is a second signal that exists in nature that could line up exactly with these black dots that I've taken. So it's up to the engineer who built the system to know that any and all signals that come into the system will meet the Nyquist rate for. And if the signal comes into the system that the Nyquist rate wasn't met for, then we just had a crappy engineering build. But as an engineer, we know what types of signals we're going to have come into our system. We know that in advance because that's what we're building it for, right? Is those signals. But anyways, this right here illustrates aliasing. Now, if I undersampled and I was a crappy engineer and I undersampled, it's ambiguous which one of these two signals meets the samples that we got with the black dots. So it could be this long wave one or it could be the short wave one, and we don't know. And whatever our system is meant for, if it chooses the wrong signal, then it just misrepresented our output. Our output is some manipulation of, the signal that comes into it, right? So if we put the wrong signal in, we're going to get the wrong output. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I see we saw Dennis join. Do you have any questions, Dennis? And Homer. Homer, do you have any questions? All right. So this, all right, Homer, how's it going? All right. So this was also streamed to YouTube, and the video will be available for if you want to catch up on stuff you've been catch before. We're basically answering questions. Homer, do you have any questions, or anybody else have any questions? Alrighty. And yes, I'm actually old enough to remember using Windows 3.1. That's what we used in my high school. So.
Yeah, we are going to see some aliasing issues whenever people start buying more and more 4K TVs, but we only have HD signals. You'll start to see some aliasing when you walk up real close to your 4K display. So that's a good example for what we see nowadays. HDMI 2 is flawless.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I guess. I don't know enough about it, but well, I guess if nobody has any questions, I don't want to stall in here. But we'll stay on for as long as anybody needs us.
I'm gonna stop the YouTube broadcast.